Sometimes the kindest person in the room is the one everyone else is ready to destroy. Emily Carter never imagined that helping a freezing stranger on a rainy Tuesday night would cost her everything. The lobby of Whitmore Financial Tower fell completely silent as two security guards escorted her toward the glass entrance while dozens of employees stood frozen with coffee cups in their hands, pretending not to stare but unable to look away. Emily's cheeks burned with humiliation as her purse slipped from her shoulder and hit the marble floor, spilling crayons, overdue bills, and a small bottle of children's fever medicine across the lobby. Nobody moved to help her. Not one person. Her voice cracked as she looked toward her manager standing near the reception desk with crossed arms and a satisfied expression. "I was only trying to help him," Emily whispered, fighting back tears. Vanessa Cole adjusted the sleeve of her designer blazer and shook her head coldly. "You embarrassed this company in front of clients," she said loud enough for everyone to hear. "You chose some homeless man over your responsibilities." Emily swallowed hard as the guards opened the massive glass doors and icy wind rushed into the building. Outside, rain poured onto the crowded streets of downtown Chicago, while people hurried beneath umbrellas without noticing the woman being thrown out of her job 3 weeks before Christmas. Emily looked back one last time, her eyes desperately searching the crowd. She wasn't angry. She wasn't even defending herself anymore. She was looking for the stranger. But he was gone. 12 hours earlier, Emily had been standing behind the café counter inside the same building trying to ignore the throbbing pain in her feet after working nearly 10 straight hours. Her phone buzzed again inside her apron pocket. Another text from her landlord. "Rent overdue. Final warning." She closed her eyes for a second before slipping the phone away. At home, her 8-year-old son Mason was fighting a fever, and the babysitter had already warned her she couldn't stay past midnight unless Emily paid extra. But overtime tips at the cafe were the only reason they still had groceries in the refrigerator. The evening rush had finally slowed when the front doors opened and a tall older man stepped quietly inside, soaked from the rain. His gray coat looked worn, his shoes were damp, and several customers immediately glanced away with uncomfortable expressions. One businessman near the window muttered under his breath, "Great, another drifter." The stranger walked slowly toward the counter, his hands trembling slightly from the cold. "Could I just sit somewhere warm for a few minutes?" he asked softly. Before Emily could answer, Vanessa appeared beside her with an irritated sigh. "Restrooms are for paying customers only," she snapped. "Sir, you need to leave." The man nodded politely and turned toward the door without arguing. Something about the exhaustion in his eyes stopped Emily cold. She looked outside at the freezing rain pounding against the sidewalk, then back at the man's shaking hands. And in that moment, despite every warning in her head telling her not to risk her job, Emily Carter made the decision that would change her entire life forever. Emily glanced nervously toward the security cameras mounted above the cafe counter before quietly reaching into her apron pocket. She pulled out a crumpled $10 bill, the last cash tip she had earned that day, and placed it into the register herself. "1 chicken soup and coffee," she told the cashier softly before picking up the tray with trembling hands. The older man looked surprised as she guided him toward a quiet table near the back window. Rainwater dripped from his coat onto the floor while customers nearby exchanged judgmental looks. Emily ignored them. "You should warm up before going back outside," she said gently as she placed the soup in front of him. For the first time since entering the cafe, the stranger gave a faint smile. "That is very kind of you," he replied. His voice sounded calm and educated, not rough like she expected. Emily noticed it immediately but said nothing. She had spent years learning not to ask people embarrassing questions. The man carefully wrapped his hands around the coffee cup as though he had not felt warmth in days. Emily returned to the counter before Vanessa could notice how long she had been gone, but her manager was already staring at her with narrowed eyes. "Tell me you did not just give company food away," Vanessa said sharply. Emily lowered her voice. "I paid for it myself." Vanessa crossed her arms. "That is not the point. Clients come here to feel comfortable, not to eat beside street people." Emily looked over at the stranger sitting quietly alone. He was not bothering anyone. In fact, he sat straighter and more respectfully than half the businessmen who came through every morning barking orders without saying thank you. "He just needed somewhere warm for a few minutes," Emily answered carefully. Vanessa leaned closer. You are a waitress, Emily, not a social worker. Before Emily could respond, her phone buzzed again. She checked the screen and felt her stomach tighten. Another message from the babysitter. Mason's fever was getting worse. Emily quickly typed back that she would be home soon, even though she knew she still had 3 hours left in her shift. She looked toward the wall clock and silently calculated whether she could afford another bottle of medicine before payday. Probably not. A group of wealthy clients entered the cafe laughing loudly, shaking rain from expensive coats as they took seats near the window. Vanessa immediately straightened her posture and rushed over with her polished customer service smile. Good evening, gentlemen, she said warmly. Your usual table is ready. One of the men suddenly noticed the stranger in the corner and frowned. What is that guy doing in here? He asked loudly enough for several customers to hear. Vanessa's face flushed with embarrassment. She turned toward Emily instantly. Handle this now, she hissed under her breath. Emily hesitated. Every instinct told her the situation was about to spiral out of control. She slowly approached the table near the back where the stranger sat quietly eating his soup. Up close, she noticed his wristwatch beneath the edge of his sleeve. Even in the dim lighting, she could tell it looked expensive. Very expensive. The stranger caught her looking and gently adjusted his sleeve to hide it. Then he looked up at her with strangely calm eyes. You should not get yourself in trouble because of me, he said quietly. But before Emily could answer, Vanessa's angry voice suddenly echoed across the cafe. Security needs to remove this man immediately. And within seconds, every customer in the room turned to watch what happened next. The entire cafe grew tense as 2 building security guards stepped through the front entrance, their dark jackets still wet from the storm outside. Conversations faded into whispers while customers turned in their seats to watch. Emily felt her chest tighten immediately. She hated the way people suddenly looked at the stranger like he was dangerous, even though he had done absolutely nothing wrong. The older man slowly placed his spoon down beside the half-finished bowl of soup and calmly folded his hands together on the table. He did not argue. He did not panic. Somehow that made the situation even more uncomfortable. Vanessa walked toward the guards with dramatic frustration written across her face. That is him, she announced loudly while pointing toward the back table. He has been loitering here and disturbing customers. Emily's eyes widened. That is not true, she said quickly. Vanessa shot her a warning look. Stay out of this. One of the guards approached the stranger politely. Sir, we are going to need you to leave the building. The man nodded slowly as though he expected this already. He reached for his coat without complaint. But before he could stand, Emily stepped forward. Wait, she said nervously. Every customer in the cafe looked at her now. Even the espresso machine seemed suddenly silent. Emily swallowed hard, already feeling the danger of what she was about to do. He paid for his food, she said carefully. And he has not caused any problems. Vanessa stared at her in disbelief. Emily enough. But Emily could not stop herself. She thought about Mason lying sick at home. She thought about all the nights she had felt invisible after her divorce, working double shifts while strangers treated her like she did not matter. Something inside her refused to let another human being be humiliated simply because they looked poor. It is freezing outside, Emily continued softly. He only needed somewhere warm for a few minutes. One of the businessmen near the window laughed quietly. This is unbelievable. Vanessa turned bright red with embarrassment. You are creating a scene in front of executives, she snapped. Do you have any idea who comes through this building? Emily looked around the cafe. Expensive suits. Watches worth more than her monthly rent. People avoiding eye contact because kindness had suddenly become awkward to witness. Then her eyes drifted back toward the stranger. To her surprise, he was studying her carefully, almost thoughtfully, as if he were trying to understand why she was defending him at all. Miss Carter, he said calmly, reading her name tag. You really should not risk your position for me. Emily forced a tired smile. Somebody should care, she answered quietly. For the briefest moment, something changed in the man's expression. Not pity, not embarrassment. Respect. Real respect. Then one of the guards cleared his throat awkwardly. Sir, we still need you to come with us. The stranger stood slowly, taller than Emily realized before. As he slipped on his worn coat, a black luxury vehicle pulled up outside the cafe windows. Several customers noticed it immediately. The car was sleek, expensive, and definitely out of place on a rainy night outside a corporate cafe. A sharply dressed driver stepped out holding an umbrella while speaking urgently into an earpiece. Vanessa frowned in confusion. Emily noticed the stranger glance briefly toward the vehicle before quickly looking away. Then, without another word, he reached into his pocket and placed something small beside his empty soup bowl. "Thank you for your kindness," he told Emily softly before following security toward the exit. Emily looked down after he left and discovered a folded napkin sitting on the table. Written neatly in dark ink were only 6 words. "Good people are hard to find." And somehow, despite the chaos around her, those words sent a strange chill through her entire body. Emily stood frozen beside the table long after the stranger disappeared through the cafe doors. The folded napkin remained in her hand while rain hammered against the giant lobby windows outside. Something about the way he carried himself did not make sense. Homeless men did not arrive in luxury cars with private drivers waiting outside in the storm. They did not wear watches that looked like they belonged behind locked jewelry cases. And they definitely did not speak with the calm confidence of someone used to being listened to. "Are you seriously still standing there?" Vanessa's sharp voice snapped Emily back to reality. Several customers had returned to their conversations, but Emily could still feel the lingering judgment in the room. Vanessa marched toward her in high heels, lowering her voice just enough to sound controlled while remaining furious underneath. "You embarrassed me tonight." Emily carefully folded the napkin and slipped it into her apron pocket. "I was only trying to help someone." Vanessa laughed bitterly. "You are a cafe employee, Emily. Your job is to serve paying clients, not rescue strangers from the street." Emily opened her mouth to respond, but her phone buzzed again before she could speak. She glanced down and immediately felt panic rise in her chest. 3 missed calls from the babysitter. 1 voicemail. Her hand shook as she listened. "Emily, Mason's fever hit 103, the babysitter said anxiously. "I think you need to come home now." Emily's face drained of color. She grabbed her coat from behind the counter. "My son is sick. I need to leave as soon as someone can cover the register." Vanessa stared at her without sympathy. "Absolutely not. We are short-staffed because of the scene you caused." "Please," Emily whispered. "He is only 8 years old." Vanessa crossed her arms. "Maybe you should have thought about your responsibilities before wasting time playing hero tonight." The words hit harder than Emily expected. Around them, customers pretended not to listen while secretly hearing every second. Emily swallowed the lump in her throat and forced herself not to cry in public. She needed this job too badly. Rent was overdue. Mason needed medicine. Her old Honda barely had enough gas left to get home. She could not afford to lose control right now. So she nodded quietly and returned behind the counter. The next hour felt endless. Coffee orders blurred together while exhaustion settled deep into Emily's bones. Every few minutes she checked her phone for updates about Mason. Every minute felt heavier than the last. Then, just before closing time, Vanessa walked over holding a printed document in her hand. Her expression was coldly professional now, almost rehearsed. "Corporate received complaints from 2 executive clients tonight," she announced. Emily stared at her, confused. "What?" Vanessa placed the paper on the counter. "Your behavior created an uncomfortable environment inside the cafe." Emily looked down at the document but could barely focus on the words. "You are writing me up for helping someone?" "I am documenting misconduct," Vanessa corrected sharply. "You openly challenged management in front of customers." Emily felt anger rise for the first time all night. Because nobody else was treating him like a human being. Vanessa leaned closer. "This building serves some of the most powerful people in Chicago. Image matters here." Emily looked directly at her manager. Then maybe kindness should matter too. For a split second, the entire cafe went silent again. Vanessa's jaw tightened instantly. She picked up the document and gave a thin smile that made Emily's stomach drop. "Clock out," she said coldly. "Tomorrow morning. Human Resources wants to speak with you personally." And as Emily walked toward the employee exit with fear twisting inside her chest, She had no idea that somewhere across the city, the mysterious stranger was already making a phone call that would change every life inside that building by sunrise. Emily drove home through the storm with both hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, while the windshield wipers struggled against the freezing rain. Her old Honda rattled every time she stopped at a red light, and the fuel warning light blinked steadily on the dashboard. Normally she would have stopped for gas before heading home, but tonight she only had $11 left in her checking account until payday. Every mile felt heavier after. The conversation with Vanessa. Human resources meetings never meant anything good for employees like her. By the time Emily reached her apartment complex on the south side of Chicago, it was nearly midnight. She hurried through the rain carrying a plastic pharmacy bag with children's fever medicine she could barely afford. Water soaked through her sneakers before she even reached the building entrance. Inside apartment 3B, the air smelled faintly of soup and humidifier mist. Mason lay curled beneath blankets on the couch while the babysitter sat beside him watching cartoons quietly. The little boy's cheeks were flushed pink from fever, but his tired face brightened slightly when he saw his mother. "Mom," he whispered weakly. Emily rushed over immediately, kneeling beside him and brushing damp hair away from his forehead. "Hey, sweetheart." Her voice softened instantly. "I am home." The babysitter stood up with concern in her eyes. "His fever finally dropped a little about 20 minutes ago." Emily exhaled in relief. "Thank you for staying late." After paying the babysitter nearly all the cash she had left, Emily locked the apartment door and sat quietly beside her son. Mason leaned against her shoulder while she gave him medicine and wrapped another blanket around him. "Did you have a bad day?" he asked sleepily. Emily forced a smile even though exhaustion sat heavily behind her eyes. "Just a long one." Mason looked up at her carefully. "Dad used to sound like that before he left." The words caught her completely off guard. Emily looked away quickly before her son could notice the pain crossing her face. It had been almost 3 years since her husband walked away after deciding fatherhood and bills were not the future he wanted anymore. Since then, Emily had learned to survive on overtime shifts, cheap groceries, and constant worry. But some nights still felt unbearably lonely. "You do not have to worry about me," she whispered gently while kissing Mason's forehead. "Everything is going to be okay." But deep down she was no longer sure that was true. Around 6 the next morning, Emily woke up on the couch with stiff shoulders and panic already settling into her chest. Her phone alarm had been drowned out by dozens of notifications overnight. Missed calls from work. Emails from human resources. Her stomach dropped immediately. She opened the first email with trembling hands. Mandatory attendance required. Meeting scheduled for 8 o'clock sharp. Emily closed her eyes for a moment, silently praying this was only another warning. Maybe suspension. Maybe probation. Anything but termination. She could survive embarrassment. She could survive rude customers and impossible managers. But she could not survive unemployment right now. Not with rent overdue and Mason depending on her for everything. After dropping Mason at school with a promise she would pick him up early if he still felt sick, Emily drove downtown beneath dark gray skies that made the city feel colder than usual. When she entered Whitmore Financial Tower, employees were gathered in small nervous groups whispering near the elevators. Something felt strange immediately. Security guards stood near the lobby entrance speaking urgently into radios. Several executives looked tense. Then Emily noticed Vanessa near the reception desk fixing her hair and adjusting her blazer nervously as though someone important was coming to the building. The moment Vanessa spotted Emily, her expression hardened again. "Human Resources is waiting upstairs," she said coldly. Emily nodded quietly and stepped into the elevator alone. But just before the doors closed, she overheard one sentence from 2 executives standing nearby that made her pulse suddenly quicken. "Nobody knows why Daniel Whitmore called an emergency board meeting at 7 this morning." Emily stepped out of the elevator onto the 32nd floor with a knot tightening in her stomach. The Human Resources Department sat at the far end of a polished hallway lined with framed photographs of company achievements and smiling executives. Normally employees only came up here for promotions, onboarding meetings, or terminations. Judging by the sympathetic look the receptionist gave her when she checked in, Emily already knew which one this would be. "Please have a seat," the receptionist said softly. Emily nodded and, sat alone beside the large windows overlooking downtown Chicago. Snow had begun mixing with the rain now, covering the streets below in gray slush while traffic crawled through the morning rush. Her hands felt ice-cold despite the warmth inside the building. Across the room, mounted televisions displayed financial news coverage. Every channel seemed focused on the same story. Whitmore Financial stock prices were surging after rumors of a major restructuring inside the company. Emily barely noticed. All she could think about was how she would explain losing her job to Mason. The human resources director finally opened the office door and called her name. Emily Carter? Emily stood immediately, smoothing wrinkles from her café uniform before following the woman into a conference room. Vanessa was already sitting at the table with a perfectly organized folder in front of her. The moment Emily saw her expression, her chest sank. Vanessa looked almost pleased. "Please sit," the human resources director said professionally. Emily lowered herself into the chair quietly. The room smelled faintly of coffee and printer paper. Everything about it felt cold and impersonal. The director folded her hands together carefully. "Miss Carter, concerns were raised regarding your conduct during last night's shift." Vanessa wasted no time jumping in. Emily directly challenged management authority in front of multiple executive clients, she said smoothly. She disrupted the customer experience and created liability concerns by allowing an unidentified individual to remain on the property. Emily stared at her in disbelief. "He was cold and hungry." Vanessa sighed dramatically. "This is exactly the problem. She continues to ignore company policy." Emily looked toward the human resources director desperately. "I paid for his food myself. He was respectful the entire time." "That is not the issue," Vanessa interrupted sharply. "Our clients expect professionalism." Emily felt frustration burning behind her exhaustion now. Professionalism should not mean treating people like garbage. The room fell silent instantly. The human resources director shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Vanessa slowly leaned back with the expression of someone who had just been handed the final proof she needed. "Thank you," she said calmly. "That attitude right there is why this situation escalated." Emily's pulse pounded in her ears. She suddenly realized the decision had already been made before she even walked into the room. This meeting was not an investigation. It was paperwork. The director slid a document across the table with visible reluctance. "Miss Carter, effective immediately, your employment with Whitmore Café Services has been terminated." Emily stared down at the words but could barely process them. Terminated. Just like that. After 3 years of double shifts, skipped meals, and covering holidays nobody else wanted. Gone in a single sentence. "Please sign acknowledging receipt," the director said quietly. Emily blinked rapidly, fighting tears she refused to let fall in front of Vanessa. "I cannot lose this job," she whispered. "My son is sick. I am already behind on rent." For one brief moment, even the human resources director looked uncomfortable hearing that. But Vanessa simply closed her folder and stood up. Actions have consequences. Emily slowly signed the paper with shaking hands. Every sound in the room suddenly felt distant. The scratch of the pen, the hum of fluorescent lights, the muted traffic outside the windows. Then, just as Emily pushed the document back across the table, the conference room door suddenly opened without warning. A sharply dressed assistant stepped inside looking pale and anxious. "Miss Cole," he said urgently to Vanessa. "The board meeting starts in 5 minutes." Vanessa frowned in confusion. "What does that have to do with me?" The assistant swallowed hard before answering. "Mr. Whitmore specifically requested your attendance." Vanessa looked genuinely unsettled for the first time since the meeting began. "Why would I be needed at a board meeting?" she asked sharply while standing from her chair. The assistant hesitated before answering carefully. "Mr. Whitmore requested everyone involved in last night's incident." Emily's heart skipped slightly at those words. Last night's incident. The phrase sounded strange coming from an executive assistant dressed in a tailored suit worth more than Emily's monthly rent. Vanessa forced an awkward laugh. "This is ridiculous. I handled a minor customer issue in the cafe." The assistant did not smile back. "Ma'am, the board is waiting." The room suddenly felt tense in a completely different way now. Even the human resources director looked confused. Vanessa grabbed her folder quickly and walked toward the door, but the assistant stopped her before she could leave. Miss Carter needs to come as well. Emily blinked in shock. Me? Yes, ma'am, the assistant answered politely. Direct request from Mr. Whitmore. Emily exchanged a nervous glance with the Human Resources Director before slowly standing up. Nobody explained anything as they followed the assistant through a series of executive hallways Emily had never seen before. The carpets became thicker. The artwork on the walls looked expensive enough to belong in museums. Employees stepped aside quietly as Vanessa hurried forward in growing frustration, while Emily struggled to keep up behind her. This better not waste my morning, Vanessa muttered under her breath. The assistant remained expressionless. Mr. Whitmore does not waste time. Those words landed heavily. Emily remembered hearing that name earlier downstairs near the elevators. Daniel Whitmore, founder of Whitmore Financial, Billionaire, one of the most powerful businessmen in Illinois. According to rumors employees whispered about in break rooms, almost nobody saw him in person anymore. He rarely visited the building without advance notice. So why would someone like that suddenly care about a cafe dispute involving a waitress? The assistant finally stopped outside massive double doors guarded by 2 security officers. Through the glass walls nearby, Emily could see a conference room filled with executives, department heads, and board members seated around a long polished table. The atmosphere inside looked tense and unusually silent. Vanessa adjusted her blazer nervously again before entering first. Emily followed slowly behind her, and immediately felt out of place beneath the attention of so many wealthy strangers. Every seat at the table was occupied except one at the far end near the head chair. Emily recognized several faces from financial magazines displayed at grocery store checkouts. Nobody spoke. Then the doors behind them opened one final time. Footsteps echoed softly across the room. Emily turned instinctively toward the entrance and froze completely. The same older man from the cafe walked calmly into the boardroom wearing a perfectly tailored dark suit and silver tie. His gray hair was neatly styled now. The exhaustion she noticed the night before had disappeared beneath quiet authority. Every executive at the table immediately stood up the second he entered. Vanessa's face lost all color. Emily felt her breath catch painfully in her chest. It was him. The stranger looked directly at Emily first. Not Vanessa. Not the executives. Emily. And for the briefest moment, his expression softened with recognition. Then he turned toward the room. "Good morning," he said calmly. His voice carried effortless authority now. The kind people obeyed without question. Nobody dared interrupt him. Daniel Whitmore slowly walked toward the head chair at the end of the table while absolute silence filled the room. Then he placed both hands against the polished wood surface and looked directly at Vanessa. "Miss Cole," he said evenly, "I believe we met last night." Vanessa opened her mouth but no words came out. Daniel continued calmly. "Although at the time, you seemed more interested in removing me from your cafe than asking why I was there." Emily could actually hear someone inhale sharply somewhere behind her. Daniel finally sat down while every executive remained standing until he nodded once. Only then did they carefully sit. Emily had never seen power move through a room like this before. Daniel looked toward her again. His eyes calm but impossible to read. "Miss Carter," he said quietly, "thank you for coming." And in that moment, Emily realized the worst day of her life was suddenly turning into something nobody inside that building had expected. The silence inside the boardroom became almost unbearable as Daniel Whitmore calmly removed his gloves and placed them beside a stack of documents on the table. Vanessa stood completely frozen near the center of the room, her confidence from earlier gone so quickly it almost looked unreal. Emily remained near the doorway, still struggling to understand how the quiet man she had defended the night before could suddenly command an entire room without raising his voice. Daniel glanced briefly toward one of the executives seated beside him. "Please begin." The executive immediately pressed a button on a remote control. A large screen at the front of the boardroom flickered to life. Emily's stomach tightened when security footage from the cafe appeared on the screen. The timestamp from the previous night glowed in the corner. Every moment played clearly. The rain outside. Daniel entering the cafe in his worn coat. Customers staring. Vanessa ordering security to remove him. Then the footage showed Emily quietly paying for the soup herself before bringing it to his table. Nobody in the room spoke while the video continued. Emily watched herself defending a stranger while exhaustion covered her face after hours of work. She heard her own voice through the room speakers. "It is freezing outside." He only needed somewhere warm for a few minutes. Daniel paused the video exactly at that moment. Then he slowly looked around the table. "Tell me," he said calmly, "which part of her behavior violated the values this company claims to represent?" No one answered. Several executives lowered their eyes instead. Vanessa swallowed hard before finally speaking. "Mr. Whitmore, with respect, our clients were uncomfortable and I was trying to protect the company image." Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair. "The company image." He repeated the words carefully as though testing how empty they sounded. "Interesting." He folded his hands together. "Do you know why I occasionally visit my buildings unannounced?" Vanessa remained silent. Daniel answered his own question. "Because quarterly reports do not tell me how people are treated when they believe nobody important is watching." The room grew even quieter. Daniel turned toward Emily again. "Miss Carter did not know who I was. She had absolutely nothing to gain by helping me." His voice remained calm, but every word carried weight now. "Yet she was the only person in that cafe who treated me like a human being." Emily felt tears sting her eyes unexpectedly. Not because of the praise, but because after years of struggling alone, somebody powerful had finally noticed her heart instead of her position. Daniel looked toward Vanessa once more. Meanwhile, management chose humiliation over compassion. Vanessa's face turned pale. "Sir, I was following policy." "No," Daniel interrupted quietly. "You were revealing character." The words landed like stones in the center of the room. One of the board members shifted uncomfortably while another slowly removed his glasses, clearly embarrassed by everything unfolding. Daniel reached for a document in front of him. Effective immediately, Vanessa Cole is terminated from Whitmore Hospitality Services for conduct inconsistent with company leadership standards. Vanessa stared at him in complete shock. "You are firing me over one homeless man?" The second the words left her mouth, several people around the table visibly cringed. Daniel's expression did not change. "No," he replied evenly. "I am terminating you because you failed the simplest leadership test imaginable." Vanessa looked around the room desperately for support, but nobody defended her. Security quietly appeared near the door moments later. Emily watched in disbelief as the same woman who fired her less than an hour ago now gathered her belongings with shaking hands. Before leaving, Vanessa turned toward Emily with anger burning in her expression, but Emily said nothing. She did not need to. Daniel finally stood from his chair and looked directly toward Emily again. "As for Miss Carter," he said calmly, "her situation will be handled personally by me." And suddenly every executive in the room looked at Emily with completely different eyes than they had the day before. Emily sat quietly across from Daniel Whitmore nearly 20 minutes later inside a private executive office overlooking the Chicago skyline. Snow continued falling outside the massive windows, while the city below moved through another busy morning, completely unaware that her life had just changed forever. Emily still felt overwhelmed trying to process everything that had happened since entering the building. One day earlier she had been serving coffee and worrying about grocery money. Now she was sitting alone with one of the wealthiest men in America, while assistants quietly delivered coffee on silver trays outside the office doors. Daniel loosened his tie slightly and studied her for a moment before speaking. "You look terrified," he said gently. Emily let out a nervous laugh despite herself. "Honestly, I think I am still in shock." To her surprise, Daniel smiled faintly. "That makes two of us." Emily looked at him carefully now that the disguise was gone. Without the worn coat and exhaustion, he carried the confidence people usually only saw in television interviews or magazine covers. But strangely, his eyes looked exactly the same as they had the night before sitting alone in the cafe. Calm, observant, tired in a way money could not fix. "Why were you there?" Emily finally asked softly. Daniel walked toward the window slowly with his hands in his pockets. "My father built this company from nothing," he said quietly. "Before he died, he told me something I never forgot. He said the easiest way to understand a business is to see how ordinary people are treated when nobody important is around. Emily listened silently. Daniel looked out at the snowy streets below. Lately I worried this company was becoming obsessed with appearances instead of humanity. He glanced back at her. So sometimes I visit my own buildings without announcing who I am. Emily shook her head slightly in disbelief. And I offered soup to a billionaire. Daniel smiled again, this time more genuinely. You offered kindness to someone you thought could do nothing for you. That matters more. Emily lowered her eyes for a second, embarrassed by the emotion rising in her chest. Nobody had spoken to her with this kind of respect in years. Daniel returned to his desk and opened a folder waiting there. Your termination has already been reversed, he said calmly. Emily blinked in surprise. What? Actually, Daniel continued, I do not think serving coffee is where your future should end. He slid a document across the desk toward her. Emily looked down slowly. The offer included a full-time position in community relations with benefits, paid training, and a salary nearly double what she earned at the café. Her hands immediately began trembling again. I do not understand, she whispered. Daniel leaned forward slightly. People can learn technical skills, he said. Character is much harder to teach. Emily stared at the paper while tears blurred her vision. The salary alone would allow her to finally catch up on rent. Health insurance would help with Mason's medical bills. For the first time in years she could breathe again. Then Daniel added one more thing quietly. There is also a private education fund established for your son effective immediately. Emily looked up at him in complete disbelief. Why would you do that? Daniel's expression softened. Because children should not suffer because life was unfair to their parents. Emily covered her mouth as tears finally escaped despite all her efforts to stay composed. After years of struggling alone, the kindness she gave away expecting nothing in return had somehow come back in a way she never imagined possible. Later that afternoon, Emily walked out through the same lobby where security had nearly escorted her out in humiliation less than 24 hours earlier. But this time employees greeted her respectfully as she passed. Some even smiled nervously. Outside the building, snowflakes drifted softly through the cold Chicago air while a black car waited near the curb. Mason sat inside the back seat holding a cup of hot chocolate, waving excitedly the second he saw her. Emily paused for one final look at the towering Whitmore building behind her. Yesterday she walked in feeling invisible. Today she walked away remembered. And somewhere high above the city, Daniel Whitmore watched from his office window knowing that one exhausted single mother had reminded him of something wealth alone could never buy. A good heart.